A man stood up from his seat and ran up the aisle towards the cockpit. As he was running, two other men also stood up and followed him closely towards the front of the plane. As they ran past the passengers, the men shouted to everybody aboard to stay seated at all costs, because they had a bomb. When they arrived at the cockpit door, they slammed it open and confronted the two pilots. They told the pilots that there were 11 hijackers on board, and that they wanted to fly across the globe immediately. Almost immediately after the plane was hijacked, the captain of the aircraft, Mr.Abate, had a few things running through his mind. You see, Mr.Abate had flown well over 11,000 hours in his time as a pilot. And in those 11,000 hours, he had extraordinarily survived 2 other hijacked planes as a pilot. Now, the odds of getting hijacked 3 times is a ridiculous anomaly, and since Mr.Abate had dealt with hijacks in the past, he likely remembered some significant details about what was going on. However, there would be a bit of a problem this time, because no matter what Mr.Abate remembered, this hijack would be a bit different. The plane was on a flying route from Ethiopia to Kenya, Africa, and it was a Boeing 767 with 175 passengers on board. It was supposed to be a short flight, but the 3 hijackers had different plans. After they went on record telling the pilots that there were 11 of them on board, right away, they reportedly beat the first officer and forced him out of the cockpit. They then went ahead and grabbed the emergency safety axe and emergency fire extinguisher and ordered Mr.Abate to change the destination from Kenya all the way to Australia. Flying all the way to Australia would pose more than a few problems. Firstly, the amount of fuel it would take to fly across the globe is far more than the amount given for the simple flight to Kenya. The plane simply didn't have enough fuel to meet the demands to fly there. But for some reason, the hijackers weren't having it. They had reportedly read on an in-flight magazine on the plane that the type of Boeing 767 they were on could fly a max capacity of 11 hours. To the hijackers, Mr.Abate was lying to get an emergency landing. Mr.Abate, however, refuted strongly and insisted that he wasn't lying, showing the men that the fuel indicator on the plane only indicated enough for a flight to Kenya. But still, the hijackers did not care and continued to threaten Mr.Abate, saying that if he didn't meet their demands, they would do the job. But even with this knowledge, it seemed like the hijackers, no matter what they were told, would still deny the pilot's advice. They would act weirdly refutive and didn't seem to believe or want to believe anything that the pilot said. After this frustrating interaction, 2 of the hijackers then left the cockpit and ordered everybody else on the plane to put their heads down and stop talking. They then took 2 of the hostesses in the flight crew and seated them next to each other, demanding them to make an announcement in 3 languages to everybody on board. The announcement notified everybody that the plane had been hijacked, that their destination will be changed, and that if anybody tried to intervene, they would use the explosive device. At this point, it was hard to imagine how this would end up playing out. With no refueling stops, it seemed like the hijackers just wanted the plane to run out of fuel over the ocean. So for a final, last-ditch effort, Abate advised them to land the plane at Mombasa. It was near the shore closest to Australia and allowed for a refueling stop in the most efficient spot. But as expected, the hijackers refused this sentiment and ordered Mr.Abate and the crew to fly over the ocean immediately. They then shut off access to the radio and adamantly forced Abate to turn left. In this situation, Abate likely knew exactly how this would end up playing out if they flew over the ocean. It doesn't take a genius to know that an hour of fuel won't make it to Australia. So this time, with a more certain seriousness, Abate strongly dissuaded the hijackers from attempting their foolish plan to fly to Australia. The leader of the hijackers wanted Abate to call an Australian air center to let them know of their arrival. They started looking through the flight's timetable to find a number to call to Australia and showed it to Abate. Abate used this opportunity to ignore them and instead called the company radio, informing them of the amount of fuel they had and the flight path that they were on. He knew recalling Australia likely wouldn't change much. But when the hijackers realized what he did, the leader finally snatched the headset from Abate, now angrily forcing him to turn left. With no more choices or stalling methods, Abate finally turned left to Australia. And shockingly, after realizing that they were finally on their way to Australia, the leader decided to relax by sitting in the first officer's seat and messing around with the plane's control center while drinking whiskey and kicking the rudder. Abate, seriously concerned, adamantly continued to warn him of the lack of fuel that the plane had, but he was met with almost a complete lack of care. The hijacker could not understand the danger that they had put these people in. He continued to... It likely became clear to Abate in this moment that the hijackers had no interest or care for the safety or survival of the plane and its passengers. It probably also became clear that the hijackers' threats of a bomb on board were likely lies as well, as was their claim of having 11 hijackers. As they flew further away from the shore, the plane slowly lost more fuel, eventually reaching a critical level. It's important to note that when an aircraft runs out of fuel, it doesn't just simply fall out of the sky. Planes can glide, and can glide surprisingly far. Obviously not Australia far, but quite far nonetheless. Pilots in these situations are trained to be able to land aircraft in such off-putting circumstances. And on top of this, because Abate had stalled the hijackers by talking to them for so long, instead of just turning out into the empty Indian Ocean, which would have certainly been fatal, he was now far enough south that he could now turn out into the Mozambique Channel, which was filled with islands where he might be able to land. So when Abate originally turned left towards Australia, he made the calculated decision to fly towards an island he had never even seen before. Abate realized he finally had an opportunity to ask for help. He used this one and only chance to send a message to everybody on board through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot. We have run out of fuel and we are losing one engine this time. We are expecting a crash landing and that is all I have to say. We have already lost one engine and I ask all passengers to react to the hijackers. The hijackers, now seriously annoyed, returned and knocked the microphone out of Abate's hands. Abate, more concerned about the plane, knew that the speed of the aircraft will drop significantly because of the right side's engine failure. So he began to descend the aircraft to maintain speed and control of it, hoping he could safely glide it down to the airport. But again, shockingly, the leaders of the hijackers reacted to this by violently messing and playing with the controls of the plane. The hijackers ended up disconnecting the autopilot, which sent the plane into an erratic change in speed, making the flight path become unpredictable and random. As Abate struggled to regain control of the aircraft, the left engine died. Now, with zero power controlling the plane's thrust, Abate had no choice but to descend against the hijackers' wishes. Abate was forced to glide over the Indian Ocean, right above the Comoros Islands. Now, with the hijackers' intense disapproval, he angrily shouted at Abate to not go any lower like he had said before. Abate pleaded that the fuel had already been exhausted and that the plane was completely out of power. But this time, the hijacker seemed more serious about his demand and ordered Mr.Abate to not descend further at all costs, threatening to seriously hurt him if he didn't listen. The plane was descending rapidly and getting dangerously close to the water. The first officer, Giannis, who had previously been beaten and ejected from the cockpit, had inspected the aircraft. He found passengers who were already wearing their life jackets. Normally, this would be good and proactive. However, some of the passengers had already inflated their life jackets. Knowing that this could be potentially catastrophic, he adamantly instructed everybody on board to deflate their life jackets immediately. And only inflate them at the right moment to avoid drowning under the plane's weight once it crashed. He instructed as many people as he could, and also taught everyone the proper bracing position for impact. He knew that there was likely no hope for landing at this point. However, the language barrier of English only likely made communication far more difficult for the passengers that didn't speak English. This led to a huge amount of people not fully understanding what Giannis meant. He did the best he could to teach everybody. Now, seriously running out of time, knowing that the crash was imminent, Giannis told the rest of the crew to continuously teach everybody on board the proper instructions. He then went back to the cockpit and forced his way in, past the intoxicated hijackers, shouting at them to let him help Abate. After getting in and adjusting himself into his seat, knowing that the crash will happen at any moment, he helped Abate with the heavy plane controls, trying his best to stabilize the aircraft and take control of the situation. All while at the same time, the hijackers themselves still continued to mess around with the controls, creating a completely uncertain and chaotic situation. At this point, the plane was on a collision course with what I'm about to show you was Flight 961 ditching into the ocean. The aircraft was running on almost nothing. The altitude meter indicated that they were 150 feet above the water, and the flight crew, who had done everything that they possibly could have, were now left all alone with the full control of this massive aircraft barreling towards the water. They did everything that they possibly could have, but now they had to prepare for the worst. Abate and Giannis were now forced to prepare Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 for a ditch into the Indian Ocean. On the shore of an island, a tourist on vacation was enjoying the beachside views of the ocean, recording her good time on holiday. It was a beautiful afternoon. However, an oddly placed plane was getting uncomfortably close to the water. Thinking for some odd reason that this was some sort of a weird air show, the woman panned her camera, and what could be seen in the footage was Flight 961 ditching into the ocean.